Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a forest somewhere in Europe, maybe 50,000 years ago. The air is cold and crisp. In the distance, you see smoke rising from a fire. As you move closer, you spot figures moving between the trees. They're human, but they're not quite like you. They're stockier, more muscular, with broader noses and pronounced brow ridges. They're making tools, speaking to each other in a language you don't understand, living their lives. They're human, absolutely human, but they're not your species. They're Neanderthals. And across the valley in another camp you can't see, there might be Denisovans. On an island to the south, tiny humans barely 3 feet tall are hunting pygmy elephants. In Africa, several other human species are going about their own daily struggles for survival. This wasn't science fiction. This was reality. For most of human history, we weren't alone. Earth was populated by a whole family of different human species, each adapted to their own environments, each with their own cultures and technologies, each just as real and alive as we are today. The best evidence suggests that at various points over the last 1,000,000 years, there were at least 8 other human species sharing this planet with our ancestors. Maybe more. We're still discovering new ones. Some lived in caves in Siberia, others on tropical islands in Southeast Asia. Some were giants compared to us. Others were so small they've been nicknamed hobbits. They made art, buried their dead, cared for their sick, loved their children. They weren't primitive ape men from old textbook drawings. They were humans, full stop, just different kinds of humans than the ones we're used to. And here's what keeps scientists awake at night. Every single one of them is gone, vanished, extinct. We're the only ones left. Out of this entire diverse family tree of human species that once populated the planet, only Homo sapiens remains. It's like showing up to a family reunion and realizing you're the only person who came, except everyone else didn't just skip the reunion, they disappeared from existence entirely. The question that haunts anthropology is simple but profound. Why? What happened to them? Why did we survive when they didn't? And perhaps most unsettling, did we have something to do with their disappearance? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, all these different moments happening at once. But here's where the story gets really strange. These other humans didn't completely disappear. Not entirely. They left something behind. Ghosts in the machine, fragments of their DNA woven into ours. If you're of European or Asian descent, roughly 2% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. If you have ancestry from Southeast Asia or Melanesia, you might carry Denisovan DNA too, possibly DNA from other species we haven't even identified yet. Scientists call them ghost populations, human species we can detect through genetic analysis, but have never found physical fossils of. They exist only as echoes in our chromosomes, like footprints left in snow by someone who's long gone. You might be carrying genes from one of these ghost species right now, genes that affect your immune system, your skin color, your ability to handle high altitudes or cold climates. Genes that literally make you who you are came from humans who weren't quite the same species as your direct ancestors. Think about that for a second. You're a hybrid. We all are. Every human alive today is carrying genetic material from species that no longer exist. We're living museums, walking graveyards, the last repository of multiple human lineages that once spread across the entire world. When the last Neanderthal died, probably somewhere in southern Spain around 40,000 years ago, their species didn't entirely end. Part of them lived on, hidden in the DNA of the Homo sapiens they'd encountered and interbred with thousands of years earlier. The same is true for Denisovans, and probably for other human species we're only beginning to discover. This discovery has completely revolutionized how we understand human evolution. For most of the 20th century, scientists thought our story was relatively straightforward. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, left the continent, and replaced all other human species without interbreeding. A clean, simple narrative. But DNA evidence has shattered that story completely. The truth is messier, stranger, and far more interesting. Our ancestors didn't just replace other human species. They met them, lived alongside them, competed with them, and yes, had children with them. The boundaries between species weren't as clear as we once thought, and the story of how we became the last human standing is a mystery that scientists are still piecing together, one fossil, one gene, one ancient encounter at a time. Let's back up for a moment and get our bearings, because understanding what happened to all these other humans requires understanding what we mean when we say human species in the first place. When scientists talk about humans, they're not just talking about Homo sapiens, people who look exactly like us. They're talking about the entire genus Homo, a family of closely related species that all share certain key characteristics. Large brains relative to body size, bipedal locomotion, meaning we walk upright on two legs, reduced facial projection compared to earlier hominids, the capacity to make and use complex tools, and most importantly, a fundamental reliance on culture, learned behavior passed down through generations rather than just instinctive programming. The genus Homo first appears in the fossil record around 2.8 million years ago in Africa. The earliest members, species like Homo habilis, were still quite ape-like in many ways, small-bodied, long-armed, probably still spending significant time in trees. But they had something their ancestors lacked. They were making stone tools, not just using rocks they found, but deliberately shaping them for specific purposes. That cognitive leap, the ability to imagine a tool before it exists and then create it, that's what makes something recognizably human. From that single ancestral population, something remarkable happened over the next 2.5 million years. Adaptive radiation. It's one of the fundamental patterns of evolution, and it happens when a single lineage explodes into multiple species, each adapting to different environments and ecological niches. You see it with Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. You see it with mammals after the dinosaurs went extinct. And you see it spectacularly with humans. As early humans spread out of Africa and encountered new environments, populations became isolated from each other. Mountains, deserts, oceans, these geographic barriers prevented gene flow between groups. And when populations can't interbreed, they start diverging. Different environments select for different traits. Random genetic mutations accumulate independently in each population. Over hundreds of thousands of years, what started as minor variations become major differences. Eventually, you end up with populations different enough to be classified as separate species. By around 500,000 years ago, possibly earlier, the human family tree had branched into multiple distinct lineages. Homo heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe. Homo erectus spread across Asia. The ancestors of Neanderthals establishing themselves in Western Eurasia. And probably several other species we haven't discovered yet, known only from fragmentary remains or genetic shadows. Then came another wave of diversification. Between roughly 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, new human species emerged at an accelerated pace. Neanderthals fully diverged in Europe. Denisovans established themselves across Asia. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. Homo floresiensis appeared on isolated Indonesian islands, somehow evolving into something radically different from their ancestors. Homo naledi was living in southern Africa with a bizarre mix of primitive and advanced features. Here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't just early versions of us, rough drafts waiting to evolve into modern humans. That's the old, outdated way of thinking about human evolution, as if it's a ladder with us at the top and everything else as primitive steps leading up to our glorious arrival. No. These were distinct species, each on their own evolutionary trajectory, each fully adapted to their specific environments and ways of life. Neanderthals weren't failed experiments trying to become us. They were successful humans who had solved the problem of Ice Age survival better than any other species. Homo floresiensis weren't stunted or diseased modern humans. They were their own unique lineage, perfectly adapted to island life. The fossil record shows this diversity persisting right up until shockingly recent times. Neanderthals survived until around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans possibly lasted even longer in isolated parts of Asia. Homo floresiensis was still alive just 50,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. And Homo erectus, the most successful human species before us, survived for nearly 2 million years before finally going extinct sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Think about the implications of that timeline. When modern humans first left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they were entering a world that was already occupied, not by animals, by other humans. Different humans, but humans nonetheless. Species that had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors showed up. Species with their own long histories, their own technological traditions, their own solutions to the challenges of existence. And new discoveries keep adding branches to this family tree. In 2003, Homo floresiensis was discovered. In 2015, Homo naledi was announced. In 2019, we learned about Homo luzonensis from the Philippines. Each new species forces us to redraw the family tree, add more branches, acknowledge more complexity. The emerging picture is clear. For most of the time humans have existed, species diversity was the norm. Earth was populated by multiple kinds of humans, each doing their own thing in their own corner of the world. The current situation, where only one human species exists, is the aberration. We're living in the impoverished aftermath of a mass extinction event that wiped out our entire extended family. So now the question becomes, who were they? These other humans who shared our planet, our genus, maybe even our campsites at times. What were their lives like? How did they think? What did they create? What made each of them unique? Let's meet them one by one, starting with the species that lasted longer than any other human before or since. Homo erectus. If you want to understand human success, start here. Because this species, more than any other before Homo sapiens, wrote the playbook for what it means to be human. They were the first to walk out of Africa, the first to master fire, the first to spread across multiple continents, and they did it all with a brain 2/3 the size of ours. They appeared around 2 million years ago in East Africa, though the exact timing gets fuzzy depending on how you classify the earlier specimens. Some researchers split them into multiple species: Homo ergaster in Africa, Homo erectus proper in Asia, but most now think they're all part of one highly variable, incredibly successful lineage. And when you look at their skeletons, you see immediately why they succeeded where their predecessors failed. They were tall, not all of them, populations varied, but many erectus individuals stood between 5 and 6 feet. That's basically modern human height. Their predecessors, species like Homo habilis, topped out around 4 feet on a good day. More importantly, their body proportions had changed. Long legs relative to arm length, narrow hips, a body plan built for endurance. These weren't climbers spending half their time in trees. These were walkers, capable of covering enormous distances on foot. Their skeletons show adaptations for efficient bipedal locomotion that earlier hominids lacked. The nuchal ligament, a feature that helps stabilize the head during running. Longer Achilles tendons for spring-loaded stride efficiency. Even their inner ear structure suggests they had better balance than earlier species. They were born to walk. And walk they did. Within a few 100,000 years of their first appearance in Africa, Homo erectus populations had spread to Georgia and the Caucasus, then to China, then to Java in Indonesia. By 1.8 million years ago, they were living in what is now the Republic of Georgia at a site called Dmanisi. The fossils there are remarkable, showing a mix of primitive and advanced features that suggest these were some of the earliest emigrants from Africa, still carrying traits from their more archaic ancestors. By 1.5 million years ago, Erectus had reached Java. We know this from sites like Sangiran, where dozens of Erectus fossils have been found in ancient volcanic deposits. They'd crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, entire climatic zones. No human species before them had done anything remotely comparable. But here's what's wild. They weren't just passing through. They were settling, establishing populations that lasted for staggering lengths of time. The Erectus population on Java persisted for over 1 million years. Some of the youngest Erectus fossils from Southeast Asia date to around 100,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. That means Erectus successfully occupied the same region for longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Let that sink in. 1 million years, 50,000 generations, the entire span of recorded human history, all of civilization, the pyramids to the internet, that's maybe 5,000 years. Erectus was thriving in Southeast Asia for 200 times longer than that. What made them so successful? Start with their brains. At around 900 cubic centimeters on average, Erectus brains were substantially larger than those of earlier hominids, though still smaller than ours. But size isn't everything. What matters is what you do with it. And Erectus did something revolutionary. They standardized tool production. The Aculean hand axe, that teardrop-shaped stone tool that shows up in Erectus sites across 3 continents, represents a cognitive leap. It's not just a rock you've chipped until it's sharp. It's a designed object, made according to a mental template, refined over generations. Archaeologists find hand axes that are nearly identical at sites thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years apart. That's cultural transmission. That's teaching. That's the beginning of tradition. These tools were remarkably versatile. You could use them to butcher animals, process plants, dig for roots, shape wood. They were the Swiss Army knives of the Paleolithic, and Erectus populations made them, refined them, and passed the knowledge down through countless generations. But their most important innovation might have been fire. The evidence gets debated because proving controlled use of fire from ancient sites is notoriously difficult. Charcoal and ash don't always preserve well. Natural wildfires can create similar archaeological signatures. But by around 1 million years ago, possibly earlier, Erectus populations were almost certainly using fire systematically. Sites in South Africa, China, and Israel show hearth structures, burned bones with cut marks suggesting cooked meat, spatial patterns where activities cluster around what appear to be fire pits. Most tellingly, Erectus successfully colonized regions with harsh winters where fire would have been essential for survival. Fire changes everything. It lets you cook food, making nutrients more accessible and killing parasites. It provides warmth, extending your range into colder climates. It offers protection from predators. It creates a social focal point, a place where groups gather, share food, tell stories. Fire might have been the technology that made us truly human. And Erectus had it for over 1 million years. They also seem to have developed systematic hunting strategies. Earlier hominids were probably mostly scavengers, chasing predators off kills or finding already dead animals. But Erectus sites show something different. Kill sites with the remains of large animals showing systematic butchery patterns. Projectile injuries on prey species suggesting coordinated hunts. By the later Erectus period, they were taking down elephants, rhinos, massive herbivores that required planning and cooperation to kill. Their geographic range is staggering when you map it out. From South Africa to England, From Spain to Indonesia, they occupied tropical rainforests and temperate woodlands. They lived near coastlines and in the interior of continents. Some populations might have even developed basic seafaring abilities. The presence of erectus on islands like Flores in Indonesia raises questions about how they got there, since those islands were never connected to the mainland even during ice ages when sea levels dropped. But here's what's really remarkable. Despite spreading across 3 continents and occupying dozens of different environments, Erectus remained recognizably Erectus for nearly 2 million years. Their basic body plan barely changed. Their tool technology evolved slowly, incrementally. They found a successful formula and stuck with it, adapting just enough to survive in new environments, but never dramatically reinventing themselves. That's not a limitation. That's mastery. They'd solved the fundamental challenges of human existence so thoroughly that radical innovation wasn't necessary. When you're already thriving, why mess with success? But eventually, something went wrong. By around 400,000 years ago, Erectus populations were beginning to decline. In Africa and Europe, they were being replaced by new species, Homo heidelbergensis, and others that had evolved from Erectus ancestors. In Asia, they held on longer, but even there their range was contracting. The youngest confirmed Erectus fossils come from Java, dating to somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. By then, they'd been outlasted by their own descendants, species that had evolved from Erectus populations and developed new adaptations, new technologies, new ways of being human. Nobody knows exactly what finished them off. Climate change probably played a role, as it always does. Competition from other human species, including our own ancestors, likely contributed. Maybe they were outcompeted for resources. Maybe they were absorbed through interbreeding, their genes diluted until there was nothing distinctly Erectus left. Or maybe after nearly 2 million years, evolution simply moved on. Species don't last forever. Even successful ones eventually reach the end of their run. But what a run it was! Nearly 2 million years of continuous existence. That's roughly 100,000 generations of survival, adaptation, and success. For comparison, modern humans have been around for maybe 300,000 years, 15,000 generations. We're not even close to matching Erectus's longevity record. They were the species that proved humans could thrive anywhere. The species that walked out of Africa and kept walking until they'd seen half the world. The great survivors, the persistent wanderers, the species that refused to quit for 2 million years. Everything that came after, including us, built on foundations they laid. When Neanderthals learned to hunt mammoths in Ice Age Europe, they were using skills Erectus had developed. When modern humans walked to Australia and eventually the Americas, they were following paths Erectus first explored. When we learned to control fire and cook our food, we were benefiting from discoveries Erectus made 1 million years before civilization existed. We stand on their shoulders, whether we realize it or not, and somewhere in Java, in the youngest Erectus fossils, there's a quiet ending to the longest success story in human evolution. The last of a lineage that had conquered the old world finally fading away, outlasted by children who'd learned everything from them and then surpassed them. For over a century we got them completely wrong. The word Neanderthal became an insult, a way to call someone stupid, brutish, primitive. When the first Neanderthal skeleton was discovered in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, scientists looked at the heavy brow ridges, the robust bones, the thick skull, and concluded these must have been dim-witted thugs who survived through brute strength alone. Early reconstruction showed them hunched over, knuckles dragging, barely more advanced than apes. Museums displayed them as shambling cavemen, grunting and hitting each other with clubs. Popular culture ran with it. For generations, Neanderthals were the punchline, the evolutionary dead end, the species that failed because they were too stupid to compete with clever modern humans. Then we actually studied them properly, and everything changed. Start with their brains. Neanderthal cranial capacity averaged around 1,500 cubic centimeters. Modern human average? About 1,400. That's right. Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. Not slightly bigger, measurably, consistently bigger across hundreds of specimens. Now, brain size isn't everything. Sperm whales have brains 6 times larger than ours, and they're not building particle accelerators. But when you're comparing closely related species with similar brain structures, size matters. Neanderthals weren't working with less computational power. They were working with more. Their bodies tell a similar story of sophistication, not simplicity. When you examine a Neanderthal skeleton, you're looking at an engineering masterpiece optimized for survival in the harshest environments humans had ever encountered. They evolved in Ice Age Europe, a world of 9-month winters and landscapes dominated by glaciers and tundra. Natural selection doesn't mess around in conditions like that. Every feature had to earn its place. Their builds were stocky, compact, with barrel chests and shorter limbs relative to body height. That's not primitive. That's cold adaptation, pure and simple. The same pattern shows up in modern Arctic populations. Compact bodies conserve heat better than tall, slender ones. Basic thermodynamics. For every degree of latitude you go north, optimal human body shape gets stockier. Neanderthals had been living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd had time to perfect the adaptation. Their bone density was extraordinary, far exceeding anything seen in modern humans. Skeletal analysis shows muscle attachment points suggesting strength that would put modern athletes to shame. These weren't weak creatures. They were powerhouses, built for lives of intense physical activity and brutal conditions. The prominent brow ridges that early scientists thought made them look stupid? Those were structural reinforcements for faces that endured tremendous stress from their lifestyle. Neanderthals had massive front teeth showing heavy wear patterns, suggesting they used their mouths as tools, gripping and manipulating objects while their hands worked. Their entire facial structure was engineered around this behavior. Their nasal passages were huge, larger than in any modern human population. That's another cold weather adaptation. When you breathe freezing air, you need to warm and humidify it before it reaches your lungs, or you damage delicate tissue. Large nasal passages give more surface area for warming. Modern Inuit populations show the same adaptation, though less pronounced. Neanderthals had been living in the cold long enough to take it to extremes, but physical adaptations are just the beginning. When archaeologists started paying attention to what Neanderthals actually did, the evidence of sophistication became overwhelming. They were master toolmakers. The Mousterian tool tradition, found at Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, shows remarkable sophistication. These weren't simple choppers. They were carefully crafted implements designed for specific tasks. Scrapers for working hide, points for hunting, knives for butchery. Each tool type shows consistent design patterns, meaning knowledge was being passed down through generations with remarkable precision. More impressively, they developed hafting technology, attaching stone points to wooden shafts to create spears. This requires planning, multiple materials, and abstract understanding of mechanical principles. You need adhesive, usually birch bark tar, which requires heating birch bark to specific temperatures in low oxygen conditions. That's chemistry. That's engineering. That's not something stupid creatures stumble into. Their hunting strategies were sophisticated and deadly. Sites across Europe show evidence of systematic ambush hunting. Neanderthals would drive large herbivores, horses, bison, even woolly rhinos, into natural kill zones, cliffs, or box canyons where the animals couldn't escape. This requires group coordination, planning, detailed knowledge of animal behavior and local terrain. They hunted in forests where visibility was limited, requiring close-range tactics with thrusting spears. Skeletal evidence shows Neanderthals suffered injury patterns similar to modern rodeo riders, lots of broken bones and healed fractures from close encounters with large, dangerous animals. They were getting up close and personal with the Ice Age megafauna and surviving to hunt again. But perhaps the most profound evidence of Neanderthal sophistication comes from their treatment of the dead. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have found deliberate burials, bodies carefully placed in graves, sometimes in fetal positions, sometimes with apparent grave goods. The most famous is Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where several Neanderthals were buried together. Early researchers claimed pollen analysis showed flowers had been placed in the graves, though that interpretation remains controversial. But even without flowers, the intentional burial is significant. You don't bury your dead unless death means something to you, unless you have concepts of personhood, loss, maybe even an afterlife. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an elderly Neanderthal was buried in a carefully prepared grave. This individual had lost most of his teeth years before death. He survived with severe arthritis and injuries that would have left him partially disabled. He couldn't have hunted effectively. He required care from others. That means the group kept him alive, fed him, supported him even though he couldn't fully contribute to subsistence. That's compassion. That's social bonds extending beyond pure utility. That's humanity in a form we recognize immediately. And they created art. Not just late in their history when they might have learned from modern humans. Long before contact, Neanderthals were making symbolic objects. Perforated shells and animal teeth, probably worn as ornaments. Carved stone and bone with geometric patterns. Evidence of pigment use. Red ochre that served no practical purpose except perhaps for body decoration or symbolic marking. In Spain's Cueva de Ardales, researchers found painted signs that date to over 65,000 years ago, long before modern humans reached Europe. Simple shapes, dots and lines, but their purpose was clearly symbolic. Neanderthals were thinking abstractly, communicating through symbols, creating meaning beyond pure survival. Their geographic range was enormous. From Britain's southern coast to Siberia's Altai Mountains, from Spain to the Middle East, Neanderthals occupied territories spanning 4,000 miles. They adapted to temperate forests, Mediterranean coastlands, frozen tundra, mountain ranges. Each region required different survival strategies, different tool designs, different hunting techniques, and they persisted for over 350,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have existed as a distinct species. They saw entire glacial cycles come and go. They survived climate disasters that wiped out countless other species. They watched the world freeze, thaw, and freeze again, adapting each time. Most remarkably, they're still with us. Genetic analysis has revolutionized our understanding of Neanderthals in ways archaeology alone never could. When scientists finally sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, they discovered something extraordinary. Modern humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genome in Europeans and Asians comes directly from Neanderthals. If you have ancestry from anywhere except sub-Saharan Africa, you're part Neanderthal. Literally. Those aren't your distant cousins. They're your direct ancestors. Some of those inherited genes are still functional, still affecting traits today. Variants influencing skin and hair color, immune system genes that help fight pathogens, even genes affecting pain perception and circadian rhythms. The Neanderthals who contributed this DNA lived tens of thousands of years ago, but their genetic legacy shapes living people right now. They weren't the losers of human evolution. They were sophisticated, intelligent, culturally complex people who survived impossible conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. They weren't replaced because they were inferior. The story of their disappearance is far more complicated, far more interesting. than simple competition between stupid and smart humans. And we're only beginning to understand who they really were. Imagine the moment, somewhere in the Levant, maybe near the caves of Mount Carmel, or along the coastal plains where the Mediterranean meets the desert, 60,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. A small group of modern humans, your direct ancestors, are moving through territory they've never seen before. They've left Africa, not in some massive migration wave, but quietly, in bands of a few dozen or maybe a few hundred. They're following game, tracking seasonal resources, expanding into new territories the way humans always have. Cautiously, opportunistically, one valley at a time. And then they see something that stops them cold. Other humans, but not quite like them. Stockier, paler, with faces that are familiar enough to recognize but different enough to unsettle. Heavy brow ridges, larger noses, bodies built for cold they can't even imagine. The Neanderthals were already there. They'd been there for thousands of years. This was their territory, and they knew every cave, every water source, every animal migration route. They'd survived ice ages in these lands. They belonged here in a way the newcomers absolutely did not. What happened next? Nobody knows for certain. There are no written records, no oral histories that survived 60,000 years. We have to piece together the story from scattered bones, stone tools, and most revealingly, the genetic evidence written in modern human DNA. And what that evidence tells us is simple. They didn't just meet. They had children together. Modern humans outside Africa carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That's not a trivial amount. That's the genetic signature of sustained interbreeding over thousands of years. Not just one-off encounters, but generations of contact, relationships, families that cross the species boundary. The oldest modern human remains found outside Africa, from caves in Israel dating to around 55,000 years ago, show no obvious physical evidence of hybridization. You can't see Neanderthal ancestry just by looking at the bones, but the DNA doesn't lie. These populations were mixing, and mixing successfully enough that some hybrid children survived, reproduced, and passed those Neanderthal genes down through 2,000 generations to people alive today. Think about what that means practically. For interbreeding to leave a lasting genetic signature, hybrid children had to be healthy, fertile, and socially integrated enough to find mates and raise families. This wasn't violence-producing offspring who were rejected and died out. This was gene flow, the biological term for populations merging. Some encounters were probably tense. Competition over resources, territorial disputes, the kind of conflicts that erupt when any two groups of humans occupy the same landscape. Neanderthals had been the dominant humans in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Suddenly these African newcomers were showing up, hunting the same animals, occupying the same caves. But some encounters must have been peaceful, even collaborative. Exchange of mates is one of the oldest human strategies for building alliances between groups. You give us your daughters, we give you ours, and suddenly both groups have relatives on both sides, reducing the likelihood of lethal conflict. Archaeological sites from this period show tantalizing hints of cultural exchange. In the Levant, there are caves where Neanderthal and modern human occupation layers alternate over thousands of years. Neanderthals lived there, then modern humans, then Neanderthals again. Same caves, same tool traditions, almost like the two groups were taking turns, moving in seasonal patterns that occasionally brought them into the same territories. Some sites show modern humans using Neanderthal tool techniques, the Mousterian tradition that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Other sites show Neanderthals adopting innovations that seem to originate with modern humans. This is cultural transmission. This is learning from each other. In France, there's a transitional tool tradition called the Châtelperronian that appears in the archaeological record right around the time modern humans entered Europe. It's found at Neanderthal sites, but shows influences that might have come from modern human technology. Bone tools, personal ornaments, more sophisticated blade production techniques. Either Neanderthals were innovating independently right when modern humans arrived, which would be quite a coincidence, or they were learning, adapting, incorporating new ideas from their new neighbours. But here's where it gets really complicated. The genetic evidence shows the interbreeding was not symmetrical. Neanderthal DNA flows into the modern human genome, but there's almost no evidence of modern human DNA flowing into Neanderthal populations. The gene flow was overwhelmingly in one direction. That suggests something specific about the nature of these encounters. Maybe Neanderthal women were occasionally integrated into modern human groups, but not the reverse. Maybe hybrid children raised in modern human communities survived at higher rates than those raised in Neanderthal communities. Maybe modern human groups were more willing or able to incorporate outsiders. Or maybe, and this is darker but demographically possible, the encounters weren't always consensual. When populations meet and one carries genes from the other, violence is often part of the story. We don't like thinking about it, but human history is full of such encounters, and there's no reason to assume our ancestors 60,000 years ago were more enlightened than people in recorded history. The timeline of coexistence stretched for thousands of years. In the Middle East, Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped for perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 years. In Europe, where Neanderthals held out longer, the coexistence could have lasted 20,000 years or more in some regions. That's 500 to 1,000 generations, longer than the entire span of recorded human history. These weren't brief encounters. These were two human species sharing landscapes for vast stretches of time, long enough that interactions must have become routine in some areas. Archaeological sites in France show Neanderthal populations persisting until around 40,000 years ago. Gibraltar, at Europe's southern tip, might have sheltered Neanderthal populations until 37,000 years ago, or even later, though those dates remain controversial. For tens of thousands of years, two kinds of humans were hunting the same animals, sheltering in the same caves, dealing with the same Ice Age climate swings. They would have spoken to each other, though we don't know what those languages sounded like. The Neanderthal hyoid bone, which anchors tongue muscles, is virtually identical to ours, suggesting they had the anatomical capacity for complex speech. They would have communicated somehow, traded or stolen from each other, formed alliances or grudges, told stories about the strange other humans who lived in the next valley. And then the Neanderthals vanished. Around 40,000 years ago, their population numbers began declining. By 37,000 years ago, they were gone from everywhere except possibly a few isolated refuges. By 30,000 years ago, there were no pure Neanderthals left anywhere on Earth. Modern humans remained, thriving, expanding, filling every ecological niche the Neanderthals had once occupied. Within a few thousand years, modern humans had spread from the Middle East across all of Europe and Asia, into Australia, eventually reaching the Americas. Why did one species disappear while the other exploded across the planet? That's the question that haunts everyone who studies this period, because it wasn't obvious. Neanderthals weren't stupid. They weren't poorly adapted. They'd survived conditions that would have killed modern humans. But something changed when the two species met. Something about the interaction itself, or the timing, or the specific pressures of that moment in history tipped the balance irreversibly in favour of modern humans. Understanding what happened requires looking beyond just these two species, because Neanderthals weren't the only other humans modern humans encountered. There were others, strange and unexpected, scattered across Asia in populations nobody had even suspected until very recently. In 2008, Russian archaeologists were digging through sediments in Denisova Cave, high in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. Remote, cold, the kind of place where you'd expect to find evidence of Neanderthals maybe, or early modern humans passing through on their way east. What you wouldn't expect to find is an entirely unknown species of human, but that's exactly what they discovered. A finger bone, tiny, fragmentary, from the 5th digit of a child's hand, maybe 5 to 7 years old when they died, sometime between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. The bone was sent to the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, where Svante Pääbo's team had been pioneering techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA. What they found when they analysed that finger bone changed everything we thought we knew about human evolution. The DNA was human, but it wasn't modern human. It wasn't Neanderthal either. The genetic sequence was different enough from both that it could only mean one thing. They'd found a third species, a ghost lineage that had been living alongside modern humans and Neanderthals, completely unknown until a child's finger bone revealed their existence. They called them Denisovans after the cave where they were discovered, and almost immediately the mystery deepened, because when geneticists started looking for Denisovan DNA in modern populations, they found it. Not in Europeans or Africans, but in people living thousands of miles from that Siberian cave. Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, people in Papua New Guinea carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Some populations in the Philippines and Indonesia show Denisovan ancestry, and remarkably, Tibetans carry a specific Denisovan gene variant that helps them survive at high altitudes. Think about what that means geographically. The only physical remains had been found in Siberia, but their genetic legacy shows up across half of Asia and into the Pacific Islands. The Denisovans weren't just living in one cave. They had spread across an enormous range, adapting to radically different environments, from the freezing mountains of Central Asia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. But we barely know what they looked like. That finger bone, a few teeth, fragments of skull. That's essentially it for physical remains. In 2019, researchers identified a Denisovan jawbone from a cave on the Tibetan plateau. Remarkable because it had been sitting in a monastery for decades before anyone realized what it was. The jaw was massive, with teeth larger than those of Neanderthals or modern humans. It had been found at an elevation of 10,000 feet, direct evidence that Denisovans had adapted to high-altitude life. Genetic analysis of the fossils we do have suggests they were probably robust, possibly even more heavily built than Neanderthals. But that's speculation based on fragments. We don't have a complete skeleton. We don't have a skull that would tell us about brain size or facial structure. We're trying to reconstruct an entire species from genetic echoes and a handful of bone fragments. What the DNA does tell us is their story, at least in outline. Denisovans split from the common ancestor they shared with Neanderthals somewhere around 400,000 years ago. While Neanderthals moved west into Europe, Denisovans moved east across Asia. They adapted to environments that range from Siberian tundra to tropical rainforests, an ecological range that exceeded anything Neanderthals or early modern humans accomplished. The high-altitude adaptation is particularly fascinating. Modern Tibetans carry a Denisovan version of the EPAS1 gene, which helps regulate red blood cell production in low-oxygen environments. This isn't a recent adaptation. This is an ancient survival gene that Denisovans developed over hundreds of thousands of years living on the Tibetan plateau, then passed to modern humans when the two populations interbred. Without that gene, living permanently at elevations above 13,000 feet causes serious health problems. Too many red blood cells, thickened blood, increased risk of stroke and complications during pregnancy. But the Denisovan variant prevents overproduction of red blood cells while still allowing efficient oxygen use. It's such an advantageous adaptation that natural selection strongly favored it in human populations moving into high-altitude regions. Today, around 87% of Tibetans carry this Denisovan gene. That's evolution in action. A genetic innovation developed by one species, transferred to another through interbreeding, then spread through the second species because it provided such clear survival advantages. Denisovans are extinct, but their solution to the problem of high-altitude survival is still working, still helping people live in environments that would otherwise be barely habitable. The evidence of Denisovan ancestry in island Southeast Asia suggests something even more remarkable. To reach places like the Philippines and New Guinea, they would have needed to cross significant stretches of open water. Even during ice ages when sea levels were much lower, some of these routes would have required boats and navigation skills. If Denisovans were capable of maritime technology sophisticated enough to reach remote islands, that implies cognitive abilities and cultural complexity at least equal to contemporary modern humans. The genetic data also reveals multiple episodes of interbreeding between Denisovans and modern humans. Not just one contact, but several, in different places and different times. Some happened in mainland Asia, others probably occurred in island Southeast Asia. Each encounter left its signature in the genomes of local populations. Even more surprisingly, Denisovans themselves show evidence of interbreeding with an even more mysterious human population. When scientists analyzed the Denisovan genome, they found traces of DNA from an unidentified archaic human group, something that split from the common ancestor of all modern humans even earlier than Denisovans or Neanderthals. We don't know who these people were. We haven't found their fossils. They exist only as ghost DNA within the Denisovan genome, evidence of yet another human species we haven't discovered yet. This raises an unsettling question. How many other human species are out there waiting to be discovered? How many left no fossils we've found yet, but might still have left genetic traces in modern populations or in other ancient humans? The Denisovans were completely unknown until 2008. One finger bone from one cave revealed an entire species that had lived across half of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. What else are we missing? The fossil record is sparse, preservation is rare, and we've excavated only a tiny fraction of the caves and sites where ancient humans might have lived. Every few years brings new discoveries that rewrite the human family tree. Species we never suspected, populations living in places we thought were uninhabitable, evidence of far more complexity and diversity than we'd imagined. The Denisovans aren't just one more extinct human species. They're proof that the story of human evolution is far stranger and more intricate than the simple linear narrative we once believed. They're evidence that our ancestors inhabited a world crowded with different kinds of humans, each adapted to their own ecological niche, each with their own survival strategies and cultural innovations. And some of them are still with us, in a sense. Every person of Asian or Oceanian descent carries fragments of Denisovan DNA. Genes that help process oxygen at high altitudes, immune system variants that provide resistance to local diseases, adaptations we're only beginning to understand. The Denisovans died out as a distinct species, but they're not entirely gone. They're ghosts in the genome, ancient survivors whose legacy still shapes human biology today. While geneticists were deciphering ghost lineages from fragments of DNA, something very different was happening thousands of miles to the south, on a warm, forested island at the edge of the Indian Ocean. In 2003, an Indonesian-Australian team was excavating Liang Bua, a limestone cave on the island of Flores. Archaeologists had worked there before. They expected the usual: stone tools, animal bones, maybe traces of early modern humans moving through the region. What they found instead was a skeleton that didn't make sense. It was tiny, not child-tiny. Proportionally, it looked adult. A pelvis fused, wisdom teeth erupted. But the entire individual stood only a little over a metre tall, about 3 feet, 6 inches, shorter than the average 7-year-old today. The skull they carefully lifted from the sediment was so small it could almost fit in the palm of a hand. The brain case was roughly the size of a grapefruit. At first, some members of the team thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe the bones were deformed. Maybe they belonged to a modern human with a developmental disorder. But the more they cleaned, measured, and compared, the less that explanation seemed to fit. This wasn't just one odd skeleton either. As they went deeper into the cave deposits, they began to find more remains. Fragments from several individuals all around the same size, all with the same strange combination of primitive and advanced features. In 2004, the team announced their conclusion to the world. This was a new species of human. They called it Homo floresiensis, Flores man. The media gave it another name, the Hobbits. The name stuck because in some ways it fits. These were real-life little people, adults barely over a metre tall, weighing perhaps 25 kilograms, with brains around 400 cubic centimetres in volume. That's similar to a chimpanzee, or the brain of our distant ancestor Australopithecus, and less than a third the size of a typical modern human brain. By any simple rule of thumb, you might assume small brain, limited intelligence, crude behaviour. But Liang Bei refuses to cooperate with simple rules. Scattered among the bones of these tiny humans were stone tools. Not just random flakes, but carefully made blades, points, and scrapers. Tools comparable in sophistication to what early modern humans were making elsewhere at the same time. Alongside the tools were the bones of animals they had hunted and butchered, including dwarf elephants. During the Pleistocene, Flores was home to a miniature species of elephant-like animal called stegodon. Even dwarf stegodon was still the size of a large cow, many times the weight of a single hobbit. Yet the bones at Liangbua show cut marks, breakage patterns, and burning that suggests systematic hunting and processing. Imagine that for a moment. A band of tiny humans, each about the height of a modern 5-year-old, coordinating to bring down an animal that could trample any one of them with ease. They would have needed planning, cooperation, and a clear understanding of their tools and their prey's behaviour. A grapefruit-sized brain, doing big-brained things. That paradox. Tiny body, tiny brain, but complex behaviour, is part of what makes Homo floresiensis so fascinating. It doesn't fit our expectations. It suggests intelligence isn't just about raw brain volume, but how that brain is wired and used. So how did such a bizarre human evolve? Flores is an island you can't reach by walking, even when sea levels drop during ice ages. To get there, some early human population, possibly Homo erectus, had to cross open water. Maybe they rafted on storm debris. Maybe they built simple boats. We don't know. But once they arrived, they were stuck on an island with limited resources and no large land predators. On islands around the world, something similar happens over and over in evolution. Big animals get smaller. Small animals sometimes get bigger. This pattern is called island dwarfism, and it's driven by ecological constraints. When food is scarce and there are no giant carnivores to flee from, being large becomes a disadvantage. Smaller bodies use less energy, require fewer calories, and can survive on patchy resources. On Flores we see island dwarfism in the stegodon, which shrank from elephant size to cow size. We see it in giant storks that became smaller, giant rats that became still giant but adapted to the island's balance of risks and rewards, and it seems we may see it in humans as well. One leading theory is that Homo floresiensis descended from larger-bodied, larger-brained Homo erectus populations that reached Flores hundreds of thousands of years ago. Trapped on an island with finite resources, generation after generation, natural selection favoured individuals who could survive on less, who grew smaller, matured earlier, and still managed to maintain enough cognitive ability to hunt, cooperate, and use tools. If that's true, then the hobbits are Homo erectus miniaturized by island life, their bodies and brains scaled down but their behavioral complexity largely preserved. A kind of evolutionary experiment in compact intelligence. Not everyone agreed with this idea when Homo floresiensis was first announced. Critics argued that the Liangbua skeleton, labelled LB1, might not represent a new species at all. Perhaps it was a modern human with microcephaly, a condition that produces smaller skulls and intellectual disabilities. Others suggested growth disorders like Laron syndrome or cretinism caused by iodine deficiency. At first glance, these hypotheses seemed tempting. After all, we know that diseases can dramatically affect body size and brain growth. But as more bones were found and more detailed analyses were done, the pathology explanations began to crumble. Multiple individuals at Liangbua shared the same proportions: short stature, relatively long arms, distinctive wrist bones, unusual shoulder and foot anatomy. Their teeth and jaw shapes, the angles of their limbs, and the structure of their skulls showed a mosaic of features that didn't match any known modern human population, diseased or healthy. Some traits looked surprisingly primitive, more like Homo erectus or even earlier hominins than like us. For example, the shape of the wrist bones resembles those of much older species, suggesting a hand that, while capable of fine manipulation, wasn't identical to ours. The feet were long relative to the legs, giving them a slightly shuffling gait, and the shoulders were shrugged and flared in ways more typical of archaic humans. Pathological modern humans don't consistently revert to an ancient suite of features across the entire skeleton. They're modern humans with something gone wrong. Homo floresiensis looks instead like a population that followed its own evolutionary path for a very long time. Over time, the consensus has gradually shifted. While a few dissenters remain, most paleoanthropologists now regard Homo floresiensis as a genuine, distinct human species, a real hobbit, not a sickly modern. And then there's the question of when they lived. The first announcement suggested shockingly recent dates, possibly as young as 12,000 years ago. That would mean tiny archaic humans surviving almost into the age of agriculture. Later redating of the layers around the bones pushed that back. Current evidence places the last known Homo floresiensis remains at around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Even with the revised timeline, that's astonishing. Around 60,000 years ago is when modern humans were pushing out of Africa and across Eurasia. Within a few thousand years, our species was established in Australia. That means there was a period, however brief, when modern humans and hobbits may have shared the same archipelago. Flores sits right along plausible routes early modern humans might have taken through island Southeast Asia. Stone tools at Liangbua and other sites on the island stretch back far beyond 60,000 years, suggesting a long human presence. Some older layers, possibly predating Homo floresiensis, hint that their ancestors had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. So imagine that world. Denisovans moving through parts of Indonesia, modern humans island hopping towards Sahul, Neanderthals still holding on far away to the west, and on Flores, a pocket of tiny humans, survivors of an ancient colonization, living out the last chapters of their species' story in forested valleys and limestone caves. No written records, no direct accounts, just bones, tools, and something else. Folklore. Across Flores and nearby islands, there are traditional stories about very small forest-dwelling people. In Flores, one of these beings is called the Ebugogo. Little, hairy, pot-bellied creatures who lived in caves, could mimic human speech, and sometimes stole food or children. According to some versions, villagers eventually drove them away, or burned them out of their refuges not so very long ago, in mythic but not unimaginable time. Anthropologists are cautious about drawing straight lines from myth to prehistory. Folklore can change in a few generations, let alone tens of thousands of years. but the coincidence is hard to ignore. An island with archaeological evidence of a tiny human species and an oral tradition about tiny cave dwellers who were almost but not quite human. Could memories of encounters between Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis have filtered down through countless retellings, transforming over millennia into stories of forest spirits and small wild people? Or are these simply universal human tales, grown from the soil of imagination rather than the fossil record? We can't say. The hobbits themselves left no writing, no art we can confidently attribute to them. What we have is stone and bone layered with legend. But Homo floresiensis reminds us of an important truth about our past. Human evolution wasn't just a march toward bigger brains and taller bodies. It was a branching, twisting experiment, full of side paths and local solutions. On one small island, cut off by water, evolution produced a pocket-sized human species that hunted elephants and made fire with a brain the size of a chimp's. They survived there for hundreds of thousands of years, through climate shifts and volcanic eruptions, clinging to their island world, while other humans came and went on the surrounding continents. And then, sometime around the moment our own species was spreading through Southeast Asia, their trail vanishes from the archaeological record. No more bones, no more tools, just the empty cave of Liang Bua and stories whispered in the dark about little people who once walked the forest. They were real, they were human, and like so many of our vanished relatives, they force us to widen our sense of what it means to be human at all. While the debate over hobbits and island dwarfism was still echoing through the halls of universities, another discovery was quietly forming in darkness far below the South African veld, not in some remote jungle or windswept desert, but beneath familiar ground, under the feet of commuters and school children, in a maze of limestone passages called the Rising Star Cave System, just outside Johannesburg. In 2013, 2 recreational cavers were exploring a narrow side passage there when their headlamps flashed across something pale, half buried in sediment on the floor of a cramped chamber. Bone! They took photos. They told a local paleoanthropologist, Lee Berger, who had a reputation for chasing bold ideas. When he saw the images, he realized this wasn't just one bone, or even a few. The chamber appeared to be littered with human-like remains. There was a catch. The bones were in a place that barely counted as a place. To reach the chamber, you had to descend a steep shaft, scramble through jagged rock, then squeeze through a vertical chute only about 18 centimeters wide at its tightest point. Roughly the width of a salad plate. Most adult humans simply couldn't fit. So when Berger announced a call for excavators, the job description was unusually specific. Qualified paleoanthropologists who were also small, slender, and not prone to claustrophobia. 6 women answered that call. They became known in the media as the underground astronauts. For weeks they crawled and twisted their way through the rock, spending long days in a chamber the team named Dinalidi, place of stars, in the local Sesotho language. What they uncovered there stunned everyone. Bones, everywhere. Thousands of them. Skulls, jaws, ribs, vertebrae, hand bones, foot bones. At least 15 individuals at first count, from infants to elderly adults. Later work would push that number even higher. This was not a single tragic accident, not one person fallen into a hole. This was a population. When the bones were carefully cleaned and compared, a picture emerged of a human that didn't fit neatly anywhere on our tree. They named it Homo naledi. Naledi again means star. In some ways, Naledi looked old, very old. The skull was small, with a brain case only about 460 to 610 cubic centimeters. That's in the same low range as Homo habilis and Homo erectus, far smaller than Neanderthals or us. Parts of the pelvis and the shape of the torso looked primitive, closer to earlier members of our genus than to modern humans. The shoulders were high and shrugged, the fingers curved and powerful, as if climbing was still a regular part of life. The wrists and some aspects of the upper limb suggested strong hands that could both grip branches and manipulate tools, but not quite with our exact anatomy. And yet, other bones told a different story. The feet were remarkably modern-looking, arched, with a robust heel, built for long-distance walking on two legs. The legs were long relative to the arms, like ours, indicating an efficient upright gait. The teeth were small and organized in a pattern closer to later Homo than to early toolmakers. The skull, though small, had a shape hinting at more advanced organization inside. It was a mosaic creature, ancient and modern fused together. A body built partly from recycled blueprints and partly from designs we recognize in ourselves. At first, many researchers assumed Homo naledi must be very old. Maybe 2 million years, maybe a side branch surviving from the earliest days of Homo, preserved in this cave like a time capsule. That would have been strange enough. Then came the dates. In 2017, after painstaking attempts to date the sediments, the flowstones, and even the teeth themselves, the team announced their best estimate. The bones in the Dinaledi chamber were between about 236,000 and 335,000 years old. Not 2 million years, 200,000 or 300,000. That means Homo naledi was alive during a period when our own species, or something very close to it, already existed in Africa. While the ancestors of Homo sapiens were emerging with larger brains and increasingly modern faces, this small-brained, archaic-looking cousin was still walking the land. Not as a relic from the deep past, but as a contemporary. Two very different kinds of human, sharing the same continent. And yet the age of Naledi is only half the mystery. The other half is how they ended up in that chamber at all. The Dinaledi chamber isn't a place you wander into by accident. There's no evidence of a wide, ancient entrance that later collapsed. No signs that water washed the bones in, no claw or tooth marks from large predators dragging bodies underground. No rubble layers suggesting cave-ins crushing an entire group at once. Instead, the bones appear to have arrived in the chamber in pieces and over time, bodies decomposed elsewhere, or within the chamber itself, leaving disarticulated skeletons scattered in the mud. Some bones show slight weathering, but nothing like the damage you'd expect from long exposure on the surface. From very early on, Berger and his colleagues floated a provocative idea. Maybe these bodies were brought there on purpose, not by us, by Homo naledi. In this interpretation, members of the group carried their dead deep into the cave, again and again over many generations, depositing them in the same remote chamber. Not for food. There are no cut marks, no butchery patterns, no gnawing. Not for shelter. The chamber is dark, cramped, and hard to reach. As a place to live, it's miserable. As a place to hide from predators, it's overkill. There are much easier refuges. That leaves something else. Deliberate disposal of the dead. Perhaps even the beginnings of ritual. If this is correct, and not everyone agrees, it would mean that a small-brained human species, with a brain half the size of ours, was engaging in behavior we've long associated only with larger-brained humans like Neanderthals and sapiens. It would force us to ask a disturbing question. How much brain do you really need for grief, for memory, for some sense that the dead deserve special treatment? Critics of the deliberate disposal idea point out that caves are tricky. Openings can change. Erosion and collapse can erase other entrances we simply haven't found yet. They argue that alternative explanations, a hidden entrance, a series of unfortunate accidents, even predator behavior we don't fully understand, haven't been completely ruled out. Supporters counter that no such alternative fits the evidence as well as intentional placement. They point to the absence of other large animals in similar abundance, the lack of transport marks, the repeated presence of individuals of different ages. They see a pattern, not a coincidence. More recent announcements from the Rising Star team have only deepened the debate. Claims of possible inscriptions, fire use, or purposeful modification near the bones have been met with intense scrutiny. Some researchers urge caution, warning against projecting our own symbolism onto ambiguous marks and burned sediments. Others argue that we must at least entertain the possibility that Homo naledi had a richer cognitive world than its brain size suggests. Whatever the final answer, the Dinaledi chamber is not simply a bone pile. It's a record of behavior repeated over time in a place that costs effort and risk to reach. That, by itself, is telling. Where does Homo naledi sit on our family tree? That question is still wide open. Some see naledi as a late surviving offshoot of an early Homo lineage, perhaps related to Homo habilis or an early African form of erectus, that retained small brains but gradually acquired more modern limb proportions. Others wonder whether naledi represents a completely separate experiment. A branch of Homo that maintained a compact brain while refining body and behavior along its own track, parallel to ours. A reminder that evolution doesn't always push toward bigger is better, even in brains. Genetic information would help, but so far, no usable DNA has been recovered from the hot mineral-rich cave environment. For now, we read bones in the dark and argue about what they mean. But some things are clear. Homo naledi was small, perhaps around 1.5 meters tall, lightly built but strong. It walked efficiently on two legs and likely climbed with ease. It lived in southern Africa at a time when early Homo sapiens and other archaic humans were also present somewhere on the landscape. And for reasons we don't yet fully grasp, its dead ended up in one of the most inaccessible chambers in a complex cave. Imagine, for a moment, the scene without the helmets and electric light. Just a line of shadowed figures moving by flickering fire, squeezing through stone, cradling a lifeless body. Perhaps they understood death as a final ending. Perhaps they imagined an unseen world. Perhaps they only knew that leaving a decaying corpse near the living was dangerous and wrong. Whatever their motivation, they were doing something intentional with their dead. Thousands of bones in a silent hidden room suggest more than biology. They hint at social bonds strong enough to carry a body into darkness, at memory, at some awareness of before and after, of presence and absence. Whether we call that ritual or proto-ritual or simply habit is almost beside the point. Homo naledi tells us that consciousness, care, and complex behavior may not be the exclusive property of large brains shaped exactly like ours. In the black chambers of Rising Star, we glimpse an alternative humanity, small-brained, mosaic-bodied, yet perhaps capable of symbolic acts. Another branch that grew, experimented, and then, like so many others, disappeared, leaving only bones in the dark and questions that follow us back to the surface. If Homo naledi is a reminder that evolution can get weird, improvising mosaics and side branches, then the next humans in our story feel almost the opposite. They're not tiny cave dwellers or island hobbits, or deep-time experiments clinging on in hidden pockets. They're the big, broad-shouldered figures who stand in the doorway between worlds. Meet Homo heidelbergensis. If you could see one standing at the edge of your campfire, you wouldn't mistake them for a modern human, but you also wouldn't see a stranger from another planet. You'd see a massive, powerful hunter. Thick bones, barrel chest, strong hands, a face with heavy brow ridges shading deep-set eyes, a wide nose and a projecting mid-face. But on top of all that muscle and bone, something else. A large brain. In the same general range as ours. Not quite modern, not quite Neanderthal. A halfway point. A bridge. Heidelbergensis first entered the scientific record in 1907 with a jawbone dug out of a sandpit near the German town of Heidelberg. It was huge, thick, and heavy, without a chin. More robust than any modern human, but too advanced to fit among earlier species like Homo erectus. For decades, fossils like it floated in a kind of taxonomic limbo, labelled archaic Homo sapiens, or early Neanderthals, or just problematic. Over time, as more remains turned up, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in England, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, a pattern emerged. These middle Pleistocene humans, living roughly between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, shared a suite of traits that were neither fully erectus nor fully anything else we knew. Big brains, often between 1,100 and 1,400 cubic centimetres, thick skull bones, strong brow ridges, but with a hint of the rounded skull shape we associate with later humans. Bodies built for serious physical work in harsh environments. These were not marginal survivors picking berries on the edge of extinction. They were apex predators. One site in particular shows just how capable they were. Schöningen, northern Germany. Around 300,000 years ago, long before Neanderthals perfected Ice Age hunting, a group of Heidelbergensis-like humans stood on the shores of a lake and threw spears at horses. Not rough sticks, not crudely sharpened poles, weapons. The wooden spears from Schöningen are among the oldest preserved hunting weapons in the world. They were found in waterlogged sediments, alongside the butchered remains of wild horses. 8 shafts carefully shaped from spruce and pine, straightened, balanced. Their centres of gravity placed like modern javelins. Some are over 2 meters long. The points are hardened, carved from the densest part of the wood near the base of the tree. Someone knew trees well enough to select the right trunks, split and season the wood, carve them smooth, and adjust their weight so they would fly true. Someone stood in a hunting line reading the movement of a stampeding herd and timed a cast at exactly the right moment. This is not opportunistic scavenging. This is planned, cooperative big game hunting. Schöningen isn't alone. Other sites associated with Heidelbergensis or closely related populations show repeated butchering of large animals. Elephants in Germany and England, rhinos and hippos in Europe and Africa, deer and bison and horses across continents, cut marks on bones, systematic disarticulation, marrow extraction, sometimes piles of bones, as if certain places were used as hunting stations again and again. To do this, you need more than strength. You need logistics, knowledge of migration routes, communication to coordinate drives and ambushes, some kind of plan. In Europe, these people seem to have pushed into colder and more seasonal climates than earlier humans had ever mastered. They needed shelter, clothing, fire, social support. In Africa, their relatives ranged across savannas and woodlands, tracking antelope and zebra, perhaps facing lions and hyenas as competitors for carcasses. Different landscapes, same basic challenge. Survive, reproduce, teach your children how to do the same. Genetic and anatomical evidence suggests that somewhere among these broad-shouldered hunters lies the last common ancestor of us and the Neanderthals, and probably the Denisovans as well. The European and Western Asian populations we call Homo heidelbergensis are often seen as the direct forerunners of Neanderthals. Over hundreds of thousands of years, their faces would become even more projecting, their brow ridges more arched, their bodies even stockier for the deep cold of glacial Europe. The African populations, meanwhile, would take a different path, gradually shedding some of that robustness, refining skull shape, brain organization, and behavior toward what would eventually be called Homo sapiens. But in Africa, the story gets a new name. If you open older textbooks, you'll see the label Homo rhodesiensis for some of these mid-Pleistocene Africans. The name comes from a skull found in 1921 at a place called Broken Hill, in what is now Zambia, and was then called Northern Rhodesia. The fossil is sometimes still called the Kabwe skull. It's an arresting face. enormous brow ridges sweeping over the eye sockets like a single continuous bar, a wide nose, heavy facial bones, a brain case volume well within the modern human range, but with a long, low profile more like Heidelbergensis than us. Cheekbones, teeth, and certain cranial features link it strongly with other African fossils from roughly 600,000 to 300,000 years ago. Were these Heidelbergensis in Africa? Were they early Homo sapiens? Were they something in between? Depending on which paper you read, you'll find them assigned to Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rhodesiensis, archaic Homo sapiens, or, more recently, Homo bodoensis, a proposed new name based on another important skull from Bodo Dar in Ethiopia. The name Bodoensis was suggested partly to move away from the colonial baggage of Rhodesiensis, and partly to clarify that these African mid-Pleistocene humans may represent a distinct central branch in our lineage, closer to us than to Neanderthals. Not everyone accepts that change. Some researchers argue that we're oversplitting, creating too many species names for what might just be regional variations of the same evolving population. Others think we've been too conservative, hiding real diversity under vague labels like archaic. The fossils themselves, silent in museum drawers, don't answer. They just sit there, heavy and ambiguous, while humans argue about how to name other humans. What almost everyone agrees on is that these African forms, call them Rhodesiensis, Bodoensis, African Heidelbergensis or something else, are crucial. They sit at the crossroads, anatomically and temporally, between earlier species like Homo erectus and later species like us. They show a mix of traits: big brains but thick bones, large faces but more modern dental patterns, robust bodies but hints of the gracility to come. They also lived during a time of repeated climate swings, expanding and contracting lakes, shifting grasslands and forests, dry phases where survival meant endurance and flexibility, followed by wetter periods full of new opportunities. In this unstable world, selection pressures would have rewarded not just muscle, but planning, social networks, memory, the ability to store knowledge in stories and shared traditions, not just in genes. In Europe, their Heidelbergensis cousins were facing their own gauntlet of ice and thaw, refining the traits that would later define Neanderthals. In Asia, their relatives, perhaps part of the same broader Heidelbergensis complex, perhaps already diverging toward Denisovans, were adapting to mountains, forests, and rivers. One widespread, variable species, a cluster of closely related species. The line between those options is blurrier than we like to admit. Fossils don't come with species names stamped on them. They don't announce whether two individuals could or couldn't have interbred. They just preserve shapes. Bones reflect lives lived in particular environments under particular stresses. We draw lines through those shapes and call one side Heidelbergensis, another Neanderthal, another Sapiens. Nature, meanwhile, cares only about who had children who survived. It's entirely possible that what we are calling Homo heidelbergensis and Homo rhodesiensis were part of a broad, interconnected metapopulation, much like the bottleneck survivors earlier in our story. Groups spreading out, becoming partially isolated, then reconnecting. Traits appearing in one region, spreading by interbreeding, being remodeled by local conditions. No sharp boundaries, just gradients. But from the distance of hundreds of thousands of years, those gradients look like steps, and the step marked Heidelbergensis/Rhodesiensis/Bodoensis is one of the biggest. Without them, the later branches of our tree don't make sense. They are the ones who took the raw potential of erectus, upright posture, tool use, long-distance walking, and scaled it up. Larger brains, more dangerous prey, more complex social lives. They are the ones who turned scattered hunter-gatherers into formidable predators that could dominate whole ecosystems. When you trace your ancestry back beyond Homo sapiens, beyond the African population that first looked recognizably like us, you don't fall straight into the arms of Erectus. You pass through these middle Pleistocene humans with their heavy brows and lake-edge spears. Somewhere among them is the population that gave rise to 3 of the most successful human lineages ever: Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and modern humans in Africa. Different futures branching from the same robust shoulders, and while the names we give them may keep changing, their role stays the same. They are the common ancestors who stood at the fork in the path, sending descendants north into glacial valleys, east into high plateaus and island chains, and south and east within Africa, toward a species that would one day ask who they were, and why they vanished. For a long time, that fork in the path felt like the end of the map. Heidelbergensis, Rhodesiensis, Bodoensis, whatever you call them, branching into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. A tidy diagram, a few clean arrows, a sense that if we could just fill in a couple more fossils, the story would be complete. Then the ground kept opening under our feet, because even as we argued over names for century-old skulls, brand new humans were stepping out of the dark, some of them from places almost no one expected. In 2019, in a cave on the Philippine island of Luzon, a small team of archaeologists were kneeling in damp earth, brushing away sediment from bones that did not make sense. Kalau Cave, high on a limestone slope with sunlight pouring through a wide entrance and bats whispering overhead. The first hint had come years earlier, a single foot bone, a metatarsal dated to about 67,000 years ago. Oddly shaped, but on its own, it could be written off as variation. Then more bones emerged. Teeth, finger bones, parts of a femur. Piece by piece a person began to appear, except not any person we knew. The teeth were small, more like modern humans in scale, but with strange primitive features, curious curves and ridges that didn't match sapiens, Neanderthal, or Denisovan. The finger bones and toe bones were curved, almost like those of much earlier hominins that still climbed trees. The premolars looked oddly simplified, like something from deep time. The overall body size seemed small, maybe comparable to the hobbits of Flores, but with a different mix of traits. It was a mosaic, a jigsaw assembled from pieces that seemed to come from different boxes. The team compared the fossils to everything they could. They checked Neanderthals, early modern humans, Erectus, Australopithecines. Nothing fit cleanly, so they gave it a new name, Homo luzonensis, the human from Luzon. What makes Luzonensis unsettling isn't just that it existed on an island in the Philippines around the same time as modern humans were spreading through Asia. It's that its bones whisper of an older world. The curved fingers and toes evoke creatures that still spent a lot of time climbing. The teeth combine advanced and primitive traits in ways that shouldn't, by our neat diagrams, be standing in the late Pleistocene. It's as if someone had taken features from our deep African ancestry, carried them across continents and oceans, and left them thriving on a tropical island while the rest of the world marched towards sapiens. How did they get there? To reach Luzon, you can't just walk. Even at the lower sea levels of the ice ages, deep channels of open water separated the Philippine Islands from the Asian mainland. Any large mammal on Luzon either swam there, drifted by accident on storm-torn vegetation, or was carried by boats. Modern humans had the brainpower and technology for deliberate seafaring, but Luzonensis seems to be much older than our arrival in that region. Some stone tools and butchered rhino bones on Luzon date back over 700,000 years. If those tools were made by ancestors of Luzonensis, then some kind of human, long before us, crossed deep water to an isolated island and stayed. Maybe it was Homo erectus, the tireless walker, washed or paddled across by sheer accident. Once on Luzon, cut off from the mainland, their descendants adapted to island life, bodies shrinking, hands and feet retaining or redeveloping climbing abilities for forest canopies, teeth evolving along their own local trajectory. Over hundreds of thousands of years, a new species emerged, one that would never see Africa again, one that would never know Neanderthals or Denisovans face to face. They lived, hunted, gathered, raised children, told stories, until eventually they vanished, leaving behind only scattered bones and questions. Luzon isn't an isolated oddity. It's part of a pattern. The hobbits of Flores, the possible lingering archaic humans of Sulawesi and other islands, hinted at by stone tools without bones, and now Luzonensis. Together they suggest that island Southeast Asia wasn't a quiet backwater, waiting for modern humans to arrive. It was crowded, experimenting, full of small, local humanities taking their own evolutionary detours. And it isn't just islands. On the Asian mainland itself, new faces have joined the cast. In southwest China, in a region of limestone hills and caves, researchers uncovered remains that looked almost human, but not quite. The so-called Red Deer Cave people, named because their fossils were found with the bones of red deer that had been cooked and eaten. Skulls with a mix of modern and archaic features, rounded in some ways, but with thick bones, prominent brows, and odd shapes at the back. Faces that didn't sit comfortably in our species, but were far too young, maybe as recent as 14,000 years ago, to belong to something like Erectus. Were they a late surviving branch of an earlier human species? A hybrid population blending modern humans with more archaic groups? Or simply unusual early sapiens? Different researchers draw the lines in different places. Some argue they represent a distinct, previously unknown species that overlapped in time with fully modern humans in East Asia. Others are more cautious. The fossils are fragmentary. DNA has not yet given a clear answer. But their existence, whatever label they end up wearing, tells us this. Even at the very end of the Ice Age, when we like to imagine the world as already ours, there may still have been other kinds of humans walking through Chinese forests, cooking deer in caves, living out parallel histories. Then there is the Dragon Man. In 2021, a skull that had sat hidden in a Chinese family's well for decades was formally introduced to science. It came from Harbin in northeastern China, and locals had long called it dragon bone. When scientists finally examined it, they were stunned. The Harbin skull is huge, with a massive brain case comparable to ours, heavy brow ridges, deep eye sockets, and a broad, low face. The combination of traits doesn't match Neanderthals. It doesn't match known early sapiens. It doesn't neatly match any existing category. The team that studied it proposed a new species name, Homo longi, long from the Chinese word for dragon. In their view, this was not a Neanderthal cousin, but something closer to us, perhaps even more closely related to modern humans than Neanderthals are. Not everyone agrees. Some think Dragon Man may be part of the wider Denisovan story, a face to go with the mysterious DNA from the Denisova cave. Others see it as one of several Asian mid to late Pleistocene forms, along with fossils from places like Dali and Jinyushan, that represent a complex, regionally varied population that we're only beginning to untangle. The specifics are debated. The pattern is not. With every new cave, every new skull, the simple picture burns away. The tidy tree becomes a tangled forest. For decades, many textbooks pictured human evolution as a single, rising line. Australopithecus to Erectus, to Heidelbergensis to Sapiens. Maybe, if they were generous, a branch for Neanderthals that curled up and died at the bottom of the page. Now the margins are full of additions. Floresiensis on one island, Luzonensis on another. Possible late archaic humans in Chinese caves. dragon man in a northern river valley, Denisovans known first from DNA and a finger bone, Naledi deep underground in South Africa, and likely more, still sleeping in sediments we haven't yet touched. The further we look, the more our lineage starts to resemble that metapopulation we talked about earlier, a web of groups, splitting, reconnecting, evolving in parallel. Not a straight path, but many paths, some ending in us, many ending in silence. There's a strange irony here. We are learning that the world once held a rich diversity of humans, at the exact moment when only one kind remains, and the tools that are revealing this diversity are getting sharper every year. Ancient DNA, once a miracle, is now almost routine. From a fragment of bone or tooth, from sediment scraped off cave floors, scientists can sometimes pull out entire genomes. They can see ghost populations whose bones we've never found, just by noticing that some pieces of our DNA don't match any known group. Proteomics, studying ancient proteins, can push this work even further back into times and places where DNA no longer survives. Tiny molecules lingering in enamel can whisper about who was related to whom. With each advance, individuals who died hundreds of thousands of years ago in forests and savannas and mountain valleys begin to speak again in the language of molecules. They tell us that Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred multiple times, that some modern humans carry traces of encounters with unknown archaic groups in Africa and Asia, that our family tree has more branches than we ever imagined. And if this is what we can see now, with the first few decades of genetic archaeology, what waits in the caves we haven't dug, in the islands whose fossils we've barely sampled, in the tropical soils where bones dissolve but proteins and DNA might still linger, clinging to cave walls or stone tools. It is entirely possible that Homo luzonensis is not the last new human we'll meet, but one of the first in a long line of surprises. A reminder that our story is not a straight ascent, but a crowded, branching, messy drama full of side plots and characters who stepped on stage, played their part for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, and then exited without leaving living descendants. All of them real, all of them human in their own ways. And as we move forward in our tale, toward the world of 50,000 years ago, it's worth holding that image in mind. A planet not with one kind of human, but many. Some robust and cold adapted, some tiny and island bound, some climbing trees, some building boats, some carrying genetic secrets that would one day help people breathe at high altitudes or fight certain diseases. Different faces around different campfires, all of them staring up at the same stars. 50,000 years ago, if you could have walked the Earth with a modern atlas in your hand, you wouldn't have recognized the planet. The continents were in roughly the same places, yes. The mountains were already old, the oceans already vast. But the world's most familiar animal, us, was not alone. This was not the age of man. It was the age of humanities. In Africa, our own species, Homo sapiens, was thriving. But modern humans then were not quite the same as you or me. Their faces would look familiar, their bodies fully within our range of variation, but their world was smaller, their cultures still regional and diverse. Across Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals held their ground. In Central and Eastern Asia, Denisovans, or closely related populations, occupied mountains, forests and steppe. On Flores Island, the hobbits may still have walked through the forests. On Luzon, Luzonensis may have clambered through trees. In southern Africa, deep underground in limestone caves, Naledi's descendants might still have been navigating their hidden world, leaving almost no trace at the surface. The map of humanity wasn't filled by one colour. It was a patchwork. If you could zoom out and see it from above, each region would glow with its own kind of human presence. In Ice Age Europe, Neanderthal bands moved along river valleys and through spruce and pine forests, following herds of mammoth, bison, and woolly rhinoceros. Their settlements clustered around caves and rock shelters, places where stone, wood, and game came together. Their niche was the cold, high-energy hunting in harsh, seasonal climates, turning huge animals into food, clothing, shelter, and fuel. Farther east, Denisovan-related groups were spread thinly across an enormous sweep of landscapes. Some occupied high plateaus, adapted to thin air and brutal winters. Others ranged through temperate forests and river valleys of China and Siberia. Still others, if some theories are right, pushed down into Southeast Asia, perhaps even helping seed those mysterious island populations with genes and ideas. Modern humans in Africa were ecological generalists. Some lived along coasts, harvesting shellfish and fish with increasingly sophisticated tools. Others followed migratory herds across savannas. Still others moved through forests, wetlands, and mountains, exploiting everything from tubers and nuts to small game and birds. Their niche was flexibility, being able to live in almost any environment they encountered. On islands like Flores and Luzon, the tiny-bodied humans filled yet another role. Island specialists adapted to limited resources, steep terrain, dense forests. They hunted small animals, trapped birds, dug for roots, and perhaps climbed to escape predators or reach food that larger mainland species couldn't. Different bodies, different diets, different strategies for staying alive. What kept them mostly apart were the same forces that shaped them: geography, climate, distance, and time. Sea levels were lower than today, but there were still deep channels of ocean that no one could simply walk across. Wallace's line, the invisible boundary separating the animal worlds of Asia and Australia, remained a serious barrier. It held Luzonensis and Floresiensis in their island laboratories, while the mainland continents played out their own experiments. Mountain ranges divided populations, deserts waxed and waned, sometimes sealing regions off for thousands of years. When ice sheets advanced, they pushed people south, into refuges where isolated groups could spend many generations evolving in relative genetic solitude. In those long, quiet stretches, cultures deepened along local lines. Tool styles drifted. Languages, if we could hear them, would have split and branched. Myths and rituals would have become more specific, more rooted to local animals, local rivers, local stones. But the climate of the late Pleistocene was never truly stable. Glaciers advanced and retreated in slow, uneven pulses. Rainbelts shifted north and south. Forests expanded, then shrank back. Grasslands opened like temporary highways, then closed again behind the advancing trees. Every time conditions changed, corridors opened. A desert that had once been impassable might bloom for a few thousand years, dotted with lakes and rivers. A mountain pass could become more accessible as glaciers melted. A coastline might extend as sea levels dropped, linking regions that had been separate. When that happened, human groups moved. Some followed the herds. Some tracked plant communities they knew how to exploit. Some probably just wandered, pushed by curiosity, pressure from neighbors, or the slow drift of generations. And when different kinds of humans met, the encounters could have taken many forms. We know from DNA that they didn't just glare at each other across valleys and then vanish. They interbred, more than once, in more than one place. Picture a narrow river valley in the Levant somewhere between Africa and Eurasia. It's a crossroads, a place where climates overlap and routes converge. Modern humans pushing out of Africa in small groups encounter Neanderthals who have known these hills for hundreds of thousands of years. What did they see? Strangers who looked almost like them, but not quite. Broad faces, stockier builds, different postures, different gestures, different languages, different toolkits laid out beside the fire. We don't know if those first meetings were peaceful, fearful, or violent. They were probably all of those at different times. Some ended badly, Some led to shared campsites, exchanged mates, and children who carried a blend of genomes and traditions. Now imagine a windswept plateau in Central Asia, 40,000 or 50,000 years ago. A small band of Denisovans with their local ways encounters a group of modern humans following the same game herds. The Denisovans know the land, the weather, the subtle seasonal signs. The newcomers carry new kinds of tools, perhaps different ways of working stone, new traps or projectiles. Again, sometimes conflict, sometimes exchange, sometimes both. The archaeological record hints at these differences. Neanderthals in Europe used heavy-duty stone tools and hafted spears. They made glue from birch bark, a process that requires controlled, low-oxygen heating, essentially an early form of chemistry. Their sites show evidence of organized living spaces, areas for butchering, for tool-making, for sleeping. There are pigments, beads, and possible engravings that suggest aesthetic or symbolic behavior. Contemporary modern humans in Africa and soon after in Eurasia were starting to use more diverse toolkits, blades, microliths, bone, and antler points. They made composite tools with multiple small pieces. They began crafting personal ornaments, shell beads, carved objects, on a larger scale. In some places they painted on cave walls or engraved designs into ochre and bone. Denisovan material culture is harder to see directly, but the few artifacts from Denisova Cave include finely made ornaments and tools that wouldn't be out of place in an early modern human site. If the dragon man and related fossils are Denisovan, their large brains suggest cognitive capacities similar to ours in Neanderthals. Island humans like Floresiensis and Luzonensis left simpler stone tools, but simple doesn't mean primitive in the sense of intelligence. Island life favours efficiency over variety. A few reliable tool types used well can be enough. Across all these groups, technological and cultural differences were real, but they were differences within a shared basic pattern. Small, cooperative bands, using fire, tools, and social knowledge to make a living in difficult environments. The climate acted like a slow cosmic metronome, setting the tempo of contact. When ice advanced, human habitats shrank into scattered refuges, isolating species and populations. When ice retreated, steppe and grasslands spread, and those refugees spilled their people back into newly open lands. Waves of expansion, pauses of isolation, then new waves again. Over thousands of years, those pulses gave us the genetic record we see today. Layers of Neanderthal DNA in non-African populations, Denisovan ancestry in parts of Asia and Oceania, hints of other archaic contributions in African genomes. They also gave us a strange inheritance. The knowledge that the world we're used to, a world with a single human species, is, by deep time standards, an anomaly. For millions of years there were always multiple hominins, Australopithecines overlapping with early Homo, Erectus sharing the continents with Heidelbergensis-like forms, Naledi surviving in South Africa while Neanderthals and modern humans were already on the scene. Hobbits and Luzonensis enduring on islands long after our kind appeared. To someone living 50,000 years ago, the idea that only one kind of human would someday walk the earth might have felt as bizarre as imagining a world with only one kind of bird. Yet, here we are. Every other branch, from the broad-shouldered Neanderthals to the tiny hobbits, has vanished. Their genes linger in us, their tools sleep in caves, their stories are gone, except for what we can infer from bones and molecules. When you lie in bed and think of humanity, it's easy to picture a single unified thing. One species, one path, one story. 50,000 years ago that would have been wrong. Humanity was a chorus of different voices, different bodies, different ways of being, a planet full of experiments in what it meant to be human, and on the horizon, barely visible in that crowded world, were the first signs of a change that would end the diversity forever. The change, when it came, wasn't a single day or even a single century. There was no moment when someone looked around and said, "We're the last ones." From our distance, it's tempting to imagine a clean break, a great event, a single cause. But the disappearance of the other humans looks less like a sudden catastrophe and more like a long twilight, a slow dimming of lights across the map. When we try to understand why they vanished, we're really asking several different questions at once. Why did Neanderthals disappear from Europe around 40,000 years ago? Why did Denisovan populations thin out and fade from the record? Why did hobbits and Luzonensis and Naledi, so specialized and peculiar, leave only fossils and no living descendants? There may not be one answer. Instead, imagine a handful of overlapping stories different for each species and each place, braided together into the same ending, a world with only us. One of the most discussed ideas is simple: competition. Not necessarily in the cartoon sense of constant warfare, but in the quiet, relentless way that small advantages add up over generations. Modern humans seem to have been exceptionally flexible. They shifted diets more easily, exploited new foods, and developed tools that could be adapted and recombined. They forged denser social networks, allowing knowledge to travel faster than individuals could walk. Put two human species into the same valley. One can eat a slightly wider range of plants, fish a little better, sew warmer clothing, share information through larger, more interconnected groups. The other is excellent at what it does, but narrower in its strategies. You don't need violence for the outcome to tip in one direction. A few more surviving children in one group, a few fewer in the other. Slightly better winter survival, slightly more efficient foraging. Over 1,000 years, the balance shifts. Over 5,000, the valley that once held two humanities now mostly holds one. This kind of quiet out-competing could have played out again and again, especially where ranges overlapped. The Levant for Neanderthal, Central and Eastern Asia for Denisovans, coastal zones and river valleys where modern humans excelled. But competition alone doesn't explain why some lineages disappeared everywhere at roughly similar times. For that, many researchers look up, not at the neighbours in the next valley, but at the sky and the climate systems wrapped around the planet. The late Pleistocene was not kind. Ice sheets advanced and retreated in complex pulses. Sea levels rose and fell. Forests shifted, coastlines drowned. Grasslands turned to tundra or desert. Neanderthals, for example, seem to have ridden out multiple glacial cycles successfully. They had already survived dramatic climate swings before modern humans ever walked into Europe. But around the time they vanish from the record, Europe and Western Asia go through a series of rapid seesaw climate events, environments fragmented, familiar hunting grounds transformed in just a few generations. Herds changed their migration routes. Some species declined. New competitors appeared. In that kind of unstable world, the most adaptable generalists have an edge. If you are a specialist, perfectly tuned to hunting large game in a certain kind of open woodland, sudden shifts can be devastating. If you are a generalist, able to switch from big game to small animals, fish, shellfish, plant foods, and to alter your technology quickly, you have more options. Climate change doesn't pick winners and losers on its own, but it changes the rules of the game fast enough that some strategies become fragile, while others become powerful. Still, climate alone doesn't explain why only the other humans vanished while we survived. We lived through the same storms, walked under the same skies. So some researchers turn to something less visible: disease. Whenever previously isolated populations come into contact, microbes travel with them. Bacteria, viruses, parasites. Some are harmless, some are lethal. If modern humans leaving Africa carried pathogens to which they had partial immunity, built up over long histories of exposure, those pathogens might have encountered Neanderthals or Denisovans with no such background. The same logic applies in reverse. Eurasian populations might have harboured diseases dangerous to newcomers from Africa. We know what this kind of encounter can do on shorter timescales. The Columbian exchange between old and new worlds devastated indigenous populations through smallpox, measles, and other diseases for which they had no previous exposure. On Ice Age timescales, events like that wouldn't be recorded in writing. They would be recorded in absence. Fewer children, more skeletons showing signs of stress, suddenly emptier landscapes. The challenge is that microbes don't usually fossilize. We see only hints, possible crowding in caves, shifts in burial patterns, periods of apparent demographic collapse. Disease remains a plausible but mostly invisible player in the story. Then there is the hypothesis that makes people uncomfortable, because it cuts close to some of our darkest capabilities. Violence. Did we kill them? The archaeological record is cautious in its answers. There are Neanderthal bones that show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, fractures, blade injuries, blunt force blows. But humans of all kinds, including our own ancestors, show similar patterns. Hunter-gatherer life carried plenty of risk. Mating, child-rearing, and shared life would have woven their lineages into ours. From the ground, nothing about this would have looked like extinction. It would have looked like marriages, alliances, captives adopted into new families, children learning slightly different words for the same fire and sky. When their last distinct language died, when no one remembered the old names for rivers and stars, the separate identity would be gone. But their genes, their somebodies, would still be here, in cheekbones, immune systems, altitude adaptations, ways our bodies handle fat and cold and sunlight. So which of these stories is true? Probably all of them, in different places and at different times. Neanderthals in Iberia, cut off on a southwestern peninsula as climates swung and seas rose, may have experienced one kind of decline: fragmenting habitat, dwindling numbers, occasional interbreeding with incoming sapiens, maybe local conflict. Denisovan populations stretched across Asia might have met a mosaic of fates. Some absorbed into waves of modern humans, some trapped in shrinking refuges, some squeezed out by changing forests and shifting rivers. Island species like Floresiensis and Luzonensis were always walking a tightrope. A small sea level rise, a storm surge, a volcanic eruption, or the arrival of more numerous technologically flexible sapiens could have been enough to destabilize their delicate island economies. For them, climate, chance catastrophe, and competition may have combined in different proportions than on the continents. Naledi may have been vulnerable in yet another way, a highly localized population relying on specific cave systems and surrounding habitats. A regional ecological shift or encroachment by expanding sapiens groups might have tipped them into a demographic spiral too steep to reverse. When you put it all together, the Great Vanishing looks less like a single mystery with one hidden key, and more like a pattern that emerges when several forces reinforce each other. Climate made the world more unstable. Competition rewarded flexibility and large, interconnected social networks. Disease may have quietly punished the more isolated. Violence, when it occurred, sped up the replacement of one group by another. Interbreeding blurred boundaries until some lineages no longer stood apart at all. If you could stand on a mountaintop 40,000 years ago and watch the centuries flow past like clouds, you'd see the lights of other humanities flickering, moving, thinning and merging. Valleys that once echoed with Neanderthal voices slowly filled with the languages of sapiens. Island paths trodden by hobbit feet grew over with forests, then were crossed by new feet, speaking new words. The world did not wake up one morning to find a single human species where there had been many. It drifted there, slowly, one lost valley, one forgotten band, one final child of a separate lineage at a time, until all the surviving threads of humanity were woven into us. If that's how they disappeared on the outside, the story inside us is stranger, because the other humans did not all vanish cleanly. A few of them stayed, not as skeletons in caves, but as instructions written deep in our cells. To see them, you have to look at something that doesn't fossilize: DNA. When scientists talk about ancient DNA, they're talking about molecules that should not still exist. After death, heat, water, and time tear DNA into fragments. Bacteria chew it up, radiation snaps it. After a few thousand years in most environments, the script is shredded into tatters. But in very cold, dry, or sheltered places, in permafrost, deep caves, stable sediments, some of those tatters survive. Not as intact chromosomes, but as tiny broken pieces. Ancient DNA research is the art of putting those pieces back together. From a Neanderthal bone or a Denisovan tooth, scientists grind a bit of powder, dissolve it, and fish out whatever fragments of DNA are still clinging to the mineral. Most of what they catch is not from the ancient human at all. It's from soil bacteria, fungi, and the modern people who have handled the fossil. So the first challenge is separation. Which scraps are truly ancient human, and which are noise? Researchers use chemical tricks and genetic signatures unique to humans, then feed the surviving fragments into sequencing machines. The result is not a clear genome, but millions of overlapping snippets, like trying to reconstruct a burned book from tiny charred scraps. Computers compare those scraps to modern human DNA. Wherever enough pieces line up, they can infer what the original sequence probably looked like. Over years, and with multiple fossils, the ghost of a genome emerges. This process is fragile and full of caveats. Warm climates destroy DNA quickly, so we have far more genetic data from Neanderthals in cold Eurasian caves than from early humans in hot African environments. Many extinct species may have left no recoverable DNA at all. What we see is a biased sample, a handful of lucky time capsules, and yet, even through that narrow window, something astonishing becomes clear. Our DNA doesn't look like the genome of a species that has always been alone. It looks like a mosaic. For people whose ancestry lies outside of Africa, about 1 to 2% of their DNA comes from Neanderthals. For some populations in Asia and Oceania, another few percent comes from Denisovans. People with primarily African ancestry carry far less Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, but even in Africa, traces of ancient interbreeding events are beginning to appear, probably from back migration and from other unknown archaic humans. That might sound small, but spread across a whole genome, it's immense. Millions of letters of code, thousands of genes, an invisible archive of encounters that no one wrote down. And some of those borrowed genes are not quiet passengers, they are still doing work. From Neanderthals, many modern humans inherited tweaks to the immune system. Some of the best study are in the HLA region, genes that help your body recognize and respond to pathogens. Certain HLA variants in Europeans and Asians look almost identical to the Neanderthal versions, reconstructed from ancient bones. These alleles may have helped our ancestors face Eurasian bacteria, viruses, and parasites that African populations had never encountered. Imagine walking into Ice Age Europe. New animals, new soils, new diseases flung through the air on winter winds. If a Neanderthal-adapted immune variant made you slightly better at surviving local infections, your children were more likely to live. Over generations, that once Neanderthal gene would become common in sapiens' bodies. Neanderthal DNA also touches our skin and hair. Some variants affect how keratin is formed, thickening the outer layer of skin or changing hair texture. Others influence pigment, how easily we tan, how light or dark our skin and hair can be under different environments. In colder, darker latitudes, lighter skin helps the body make vitamin D with limited sunlight. Certain Neanderthal-derived alleles appear to have nudged our ancestors along that path, fine-tuning their bodies to northern skies. There are even Neanderthal contributions linked to the way our bodies sense pain, how we store fat, and how we respond to sunlight. But inheritance is not a simple gift basket of advantages. Some of these same variants come with trade-offs. Neanderthal-derived immune genes that once helped fight infections are associated in modern populations with higher risks of autoimmune conditions, where the immune system mistakes the body's own tissues for enemies. Other Neanderthal segments are tied to changes in blood clotting, which might have been useful for wound healing in a risky, physically intense world, but today can raise the risk of stroke or thrombosis. Studies have linked Neanderthal DNA fragments to differences in mood regulation, sleep patterns, even risk factors for depression and nicotine dependence. In a small, mobile hunter-gatherer band, the behaviors shaped by those variants may have been neutral or even useful. In dense modern cities with artificial light and constant stimuli, the same wiring can manifest very differently. Our Denisovan inheritance, where it exists, tells another story. In populations living on the high Tibetan Plateau and surrounding regions, there is a gene variant called EPAS1. It helps control how the body responds to low oxygen. In people without this variant, moving suddenly to high altitude can trigger dangerous reactions: thickening of the blood, strain on the heart, chronic altitude sickness. Tibetan populations carry a version of EPAS1 that allows them to live and reproduce in thin air with remarkable efficiency. Genetic analysis shows that this particular version is almost identical to the one reconstructed from Denisovan DNA. In other words, Denisovans had already solved the problem of high-altitude living. When modern humans moved into those regions, interbreeding allowed them to borrow that solution in just a few generations, instead of waiting tens of thousands of years for evolution to rediscover it from scratch. Denisovan ancestry also appears in genes related to immune function in populations across Asia and Oceania. As with Neanderthal DNA, some of these variants likely helped early sapiens cope with local pathogens, tropical parasites, unfamiliar viruses, new bacterial ecologies in forests and coasts, and there are hints of something more elusive. When geneticists compare modern humans to Neanderthals and Denisovans, they sometimes find regions where our DNA clearly comes from an archaic source, but that source doesn't match any genome we've sequenced. These are signatures of ghost populations, ancient humans who left no known fossils we can link to them, or whose bones have not yet yielded DNA. They are shadows detected not in rock, but in the patterns of our genomes. In parts of Africa, for instance, some people carry gene variants that look as if they came from a deeply divergent human lineage, possibly a population that split off from other humans hundreds of thousands of years ago, interbred with our ancestors later, and then vanished without a trace we can currently see in the ground. If that's right, then our family tree has more branches than any museum diagram shows. Some branches we know by skulls and tools, others we know only because a few of their genes are still working quietly in our blood. Taken together, these inheritances reshaped what it meant to be Homo sapiens as we spread. We did not move into Eurasia, Oceania, and high mountain plateaus as blank slates. With every encounter, we collected local solutions from people who'd already been living in those landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. A Neanderthal gene that thickened your skin, a Denisovan gene that eased your breathing at altitude, a ghost human allele that tuned your immune system to a particular parasite. These were like borrowed tools added to an already flexible kit. Some tools were quickly discarded. Many Neanderthal segments in early sapiens genomes seem to have been purged by natural selection over time, probably because they were slightly harmful in our bodies. Others stuck around, balanced between benefit and cost, depending on the environment. From the perspective of medicine, this mosaic matters. When researchers map the genome regions associated with modern diseases, autoimmune disorders, metabolic conditions, mood disorders, they sometimes find that the risk-raising variant is of Neanderthal origin. This doesn't mean Neanderthals caused disease. It means that what once helped a body survive one kind of world can become problematic in a different one. A gene that made your blood clot faster after traumatic injury is an asset when you're hunting megafauna with stone-tipped spears. In a world of cars, airplanes, and long sedentary hours, it can contribute to heart attacks and strokes. A hyper-reactive immune system might have meant fewer fatal infections in a small band exposed to raw animal tissues and unfiltered water. Today, it may show up as asthma, allergies, or autoimmune disease. Understanding which pieces of our genome come from which ancient humans can help doctors explain why certain populations are more vulnerable or more resilient to particular conditions, and may one day guide more personalized treatments. But beyond the practical, there is something quietly profound about this genetic palimpsest. When you look at your hand in the dim light, you are not just seeing one species. You're seeing the outcome of countless meetings and minglings. Neanderthal hunters who walked under European stars, Denisovan families who breathed the thin air of ancient Tibet, unknown peoples in African valleys whose bones have turned to dust without a name. Most of what they were, their languages, their jokes, their fears, the taste of their food, the stories they told around their fires, is gone. But not everything. Some of them learned how to live with certain pathogens, certain climates, certain altitudes, and they wrote those solutions into their DNA. Later, our ancestors met them, shared lives and children, and those solutions passed quietly into us. We usually talk about them as extinct. Yet every time your immune system recognizes a threat using a gene copied from a Neanderthal, every time a Sherpa guide walks up a glacier without gasping, carried on Denisovan oxygen pathways, a small part of those other humans is still at work. They are gone as separate peoples. But the boundary between them and us is not a clean, sharp line. It is a long, blurred gradient winding back through time, in which many different kinds of humans lent each other pieces of themselves. We are the only human species left with a voice, but in the depths of our genomes, the dead are still whispering. So if we are mosaics of many humans, why are we the only ones left? What, if anything, made Homo sapiens different enough that our branch survived while all the others faded into memory and bone? Scientists have been arguing about that for decades. Nobody agrees completely. But a few themes keep returning, like footprints that refuse to wash away. One of them is what goes on behind our foreheads. Neanderthals had big brains, in raw volume, often bigger than ours. Denisovans almost certainly did too. Brain size alone can't be the answer. The difference may not have been how much brain we had, but how it was wired and what we did with it. When researchers look at the parts of our genome that stand out as uniquely modern, regions where our DNA differs sharply from Neanderthals and Denisovans, they keep finding genes involved in brain development, synapse formation, and the timing of growth in the skull. It's as if, after hundreds of thousands of years of shared evolution, something subtle shifted in how our brains organize themselves, not just more thinking, different thinking. One idea is that Homo sapiens crossed a kind of cognitive threshold that the others only approached, a tipping point where imagination, planning, and social intuition intertwined in a new way. We began not just to remember the past and react to the present, but to simulate elaborate futures, to juggle what-ifs, to mentally model other people's thoughts and intentions with unusual precision. This is sometimes called the cognitive revolution. But revolutions in evolution are rarely sudden. It was probably a long, uneven process, building on foundations our cousins also shared. Neanderthals could plan hunts, bury their dead, and perhaps even decorate their bodies. Denisovans navigated seas and high mountains. Still, sometime between about 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, something in the Homo sapiens line seems to have snapped into a new configuration. Art begins to bloom. Beads, carved figurines, engraved ochre, musical instruments. We see standardized tools made from bone and antler, complex hunting strategies, long-distance trade in materials like obsidian and shells. The archaeological record starts to look less like survival and more like culture. At the heart of this, many researchers place language. All humans today speak, not just in simple calls, but in layered, structured, infinitely flexible systems of symbols. We combine sounds into words, words into sentences, sentences into stories that can travel through time. Neanderthals probably had some form of spoken language. Their vocal anatomy and genetic markers suggest they could make a range of sounds. But it's possible that Homo sapiens took language one step further into abstraction and complexity. With truly powerful language, you can do things no individual brain can manage alone. You can describe an animal migration route you saw years ago, 3 valleys away. You can teach a child how to make a trap they've never seen, for an animal they've never hunted. You can coordinate a hunting party with roles, signals, and contingency plans. You can negotiate alliances, swear oaths, tell cautionary tales about people who broke them. And you can do something stranger. You can talk about things that don't exist in the immediate world. Spirits, ancestors, future harvests, social rules, myths. Once symbols are loose, they can bind 100 brains together into a shared imaginary world. That's where Homo sapiens may have pulled ahead, in the ability to build vast virtual realities in culture, religions, kinship systems, taboos, reputations, laws that exist only because many people agree they are real. Language is the glue that holds those invisible structures together. But words alone aren't enough. You also need networks to carry them. If you look at hunter-gatherer societies that survived into recent times, one pattern stands out. Even in small bands of 20 or 30 individuals, no group is truly isolated. People marry out. Gifts move along chains of exchange. Stories and songs spread much farther than any one person ever walks. This may have been Homo sapiens' secret weapon. Unusually wide and resilient social webs. Archaeology backs this up. In late Pleistocene Africa and Eurasia, we start seeing raw materials, stone, shells, pigments, travelling hundreds of kilometres from their sources. Decorative styles, tool designs, and symbolic patterns echo across distant sites. That kind of spread doesn't happen if every group is on its own. It happens when we are woven together in loose but enduring fabrics of kinship, trade, and shared ideas. Those fabrics matter in crises. Imagine a brutal winter, a failed migration, a sudden drought. If your band is alone, you tighten your belt, hope for luck, and bury your dead. If you're plugged into a network, you have options. You can send envoys to relatives in a distant valley. You can move toward a group you've traded with before. You can call in old favours, exchange daughters in marriage to cement new ones, and temporarily fuse bands for mutual support. In evolutionary terms, this is insurance. Homo sapiens may not have been stronger than Neanderthals or tougher than Denisovans, but we may have been better at being many together, more tolerant of strangers, more practiced at cooperation beyond the immediate family. And we coupled that social breadth with an unusual appetite for innovation. Our species seems to have a particular flair for treating problems as puzzles. Change the climate. We experiment with new clothing, shelters, fire use, new prey animal, New traps, poisons, or hunting strategies, different terrain. New forms of transport from rafts to skis. What's striking is not that we invented things. Other humans did that too, but how quickly ideas could spread and recombine. A useful trick born in one valley could, within a few generations, be standard practice 1,000 kilometers away. Knowledge stopped being just local tradition and became something closer to a shared, evolving library. Adaptability became our default. When confronted with novelty, Homo sapiens often responded not by specializing further, but by becoming more flexible still. We were generalists who kept upping our game, and behind all of this loomed something less glamorous but just as powerful: numbers. The demographic hypothesis suggests that once Homo sapiens populations reached a certain size and density, everything else, innovation, art, complex language, elaborate social relationships, accelerated. Larger populations mean more minds to generate new ideas, more combinations of talents, and more chances for a rare, beneficial mutation to appear and survive. They also mean stronger buffers against bad luck. If you're a small species with scattered tiny groups, a single epidemic or volcanic eruption can wipe out whole branches of your family tree. If you're numerous and connected, local disasters hurt, but they don't end the story. In this view, our advantage was partly mathematical. Once we passed a critical threshold in population size and social connectivity, culture itself became a runaway process, a kind of second evolution, faster than genes, built on copying, teaching, and tweaking. So was this sapiens advantage something inherent and inevitable? Or were we just in the right place with the right quirks at the right time? It's hard to separate destiny from luck. Maybe if a particular drought had lasted longer or a disease had spread differently, Neanderthals would have been the ones to cross that cognitive threshold. Maybe Denisovan seafarers would have filled the Pacific with their descendants and their myths. There is nothing in our bones that screams chosen. We were clever, but they were clever too. We were social, but they formed bonds as well. We spoke, but many animals communicate richly. Our difference may lie more in degree than in kind, a series of small biases that together tipped the balance, and once the balance tipped, it rolled. More people led to more innovation led to better survival led to more people, a feedback loop that, over tens of thousands of years, turned a moderately successful African primate into a planet-dominating force. It's tempting to read that as a story of superiority, as if surviving when others disappeared proves that we